Well, it does seem reasonably clear that most people who voted purely on, or mostly on, the economic aspects of the issue, that is, would the UK be more or less prosperous outside the EU, most people who voted primarily on that issue voted to remain, while people who felt extremely strongly about immigration and wanted to reduce the number of people, especially people from the EU, coming to the country, mostly voted to leave. So in that sense, economics and immigration were the two big issues, and they did go in opposite directions, and in the end leave one out. Looking beneath the surface, of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. If we look at the regional patterns of voting, it's clear that Remain won big in London and in Scotland, whereas Leave won very heavily in some relatively disadvantaged northern communities, what you might call traditional working class labour areas. But Leave also won, although somewhat more narrowly, in large parts of the south and southeast of England, outside of London, indeed in relatively prosperous communities. So one way of looking at it is that Leave succeeded in winning by putting together a coalition of those who've done badly economically out of globalization, including immigration, particularly in ex-industrial areas in the north, a coalition of that group together with a group of people who haven't actually done so badly out of globalization in the economic sense, but perhaps are less comfortable with globalization in the cultural and social sense, and again, including the impacts that immigration may have had in the UK. Well, it's probably not possible to square the circle, but that doesn't mean that there isn't, in principle, a deal to be done. Now, many people on the Leave side argue that we would somehow have effectively unfettered access to the single market outside the EU, but at the same time be able to end free movement of workers and simply move to a policy where we treated European workers the same as workers coming from anywhere else in the world. That is not going to happen. And the woman who seems most likely to be the next Prime Minister as of today, Theresa May, I think is realistic enough to know that that's not realistic. However, I suspect that she will start out as a negotiating position with saying that we should have continued access to much, if not all, of the aspects of the single market that we currently enjoy, and that we limit rather than end completely free movement. That is, European nationals would not be put on the same footing as non-EU nationals, but equally they would have the same unfettered access to the UK labour market they do now. So this is what's been called the EEA minus deal. However, and there is a big if here, any negotiations to reach this sort of deal will be incredibly difficult and complex. People will have to eat their words on both sides, and even more so, there will be a huge amount of complexity, bureaucratic and technical detail. And remember, to make it, such a deal will have to be acceptable to both sides, and that means it means not just that a deal is politically acceptable and implementable by the UK government, it also means that it's acceptable to, at the very least, a critical mass of European Union member states. The best deal from the point of view of those in the UK and in the rest of the EU who want to preserve as much as possible of the beneficial aspects of the economic relationship is a deal whereby we have certain restrictions on free movement of workers, but without interfering with the idea that there is still some degree of a common labour market. That is to say, we'd have quotas or thresholds, limits on the number of EU workers who could come here in a month or a year. We'd implement this in as light touch a manner as possible. So, for example, we just limit the number of national insurance numbers given out in a month or a year to EU nationals. This would be messy, it would be complex, and it would to some extent reduce the flexibility of the UK labour market. But it would not be the end of the world, it would not be a disaster, and with the political will, you could do it, and it might well be acceptable to at least the majority of European Union member states. It's not a sort of fundamental attack on some of the principles that they've set out.